Her face struck the hard ground before her mind could even catch up with what had happened. The taste of dust and iron filled her mouth as blood mingled with the dirt clinging to her lips. The world spun around her in a blur of heat and grit. Behind her, the stagecoach wheels kept turning, flinging hot sand into her tangled hair. Someone shouted for the driver to halt, but no one came forward to help her. Clara Monroe lay sprawled in the road, her knee seeping through the torn cloth of her dress, the blazing sun searing her fair skin. She had crossed 2,000 miles for a man she had never seen. And this was how her new life began, flat on the ground, bleeding and utterly alone. The air shimmered under the desert heat, twisting the horizon like warped glass. Then a shadow fell across her, tall, motionless, carrying the weight of silence. Clara blinked against the glare and looked up. There he was, Graham Holt, the man she had agreed to marry by letter 3 weeks ago. 47 years old, with a weathered face and a sun-faded shirt clinging to his back with sweat. His eyes were steady, distant and calm, the kind of eyes that had watched too many summers die in Dust Valley and learned not to flinch at suffering. He didn't speak right away. He simply crouched beside her, studying her like a man sizing up a broken fence. When his voice finally came, it was low and gravelly, shaped by wind and years. "You hurt bad, miss?" Clara tried to push herself upright, wincing as her scraped knee protested. "I'm fine," she rasped, though her throat burned dry and her pride burned hotter. He reached out his hand, and for a moment she hesitated. Then her trembling fingers slipped into his. His palm was calloused and firm but careful, hands that knew strength and restraint in equal measure. He lifted her easily, as though she weighed nothing. Once she stood, the closeness between them hit her. Her head barely brushed his shoulder, her heartbeat raced against the silence. Before she could stop herself, words slipped past her lips in a whisper. "Too small. Will it even fit?" A corner of his mouth twitched. He looked down at her, a faint smile ghosting across his face. "We'll make it fit, ma'am." For a heartbeat, the world went still again. The dust hung frozen, the heat quieted, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He led her toward the waiting wagon. The horses snorted and stamped, uneasy. As they passed through the small gathering of townsfolk, whispers followed them, carried beneath the flutter of lace gloves and shaded bonnets. Clara felt the flush rise in her cheeks, not from the sun, but from the weight of watching eyes. One man tipped his hat as they passed, though his tone was anything but polite. "Riding with Holt, huh?" he muttered just loud enough for her to catch. "Careful, ma'am. Dust don't settle easy around that one." She didn't understand what he meant. Not yet, not that day. She didn't know who Graham Holt truly was. A guardian, a recluse, or something in between. A stranger who now bore her name. As the wagon creaked toward the horizon, Clara glanced sideways at him. Sweat glistened down the back of his neck. His hand rested loose on the reins, the picture of calm endurance. He looked like a man built from rock and loss. She swallowed hard, the dry air scraping her throat raw. She couldn't tell if she'd escaped danger back east or ridden straight into a new kind of trouble. What kind of man waits for a wife in a place like this? And what did he really expect from her? The wagon rolled on, slow and steady through the glare of the sun. Clara sat upright beside him, her skirt torn, her leg throbbing beneath a bandage made of dust and willpower. Each bump in the road sent sharp pain up her thigh, but she refused to let it show. "You'll open that cut again," he said quietly, not looking at her. His voice was rough but calm. "I said I'm fine," she muttered, turning away. He didn't reply, just flicked the reins, jaw tightening as the road stretched endless before them. On either side, the golden plains rippled under the sun, grass bowing low like it too was weary. By the time they reached the ranch, the light burned fierce against her skin and the air shimmered like molten glass. The place stood quiet, too quiet. A windmill turned lazily in the distance, groaning with age. A handful of horses grazed near the fence, tails swishing lazily. Graham pulled the wagon to a stop and stepped down without a word. He offered his hand again. Before she could object, he lifted her carefully, setting her down on a wooden bench near the porch. His touch was steady, but her heart jumped all the same. "You're bleeding again." He crouched beside her and rolled her skirt just enough to see the wound. His hands were darkened by sun and scar, but when they touched her skin they moved with startling gentleness. He poured water from a tin cup, washing away the grit, and tore a strip of clean cloth to bind her knee. Clara winced, biting her lip. "Sorry," he murmured. It's fine, she whispered back, softer now. You didn't have to do that. I did, he said simply. You're my wife now. Can't have you limping around the yard. The words hit her deeper than she expected. She wasn't used to care that came without demand or pity, just quiet purpose. Not from hands that could break bones, yet chose instead to soothe. That evening, when the sun melted into the horizon, she found him sitting alone on the porch. The fading light painted him in bronze. A pipe sat cold and forgotten between his fingers, smoke long gone, just like the words neither of them could find to speak. Do you ever feel lonely out here? She asked from the doorway. He didn't turn at once. Lonely's different from alone, he replied finally. I came after I lost my brother. Dust Valley's quiet, lets a man remember without going mad. Clara said nothing. The silence between them changed shape. It was no longer empty but full, shared in a way that made it somehow less sharp. After a moment, he nodded toward the house. You hungry? Come on, let's get you something. He moved ahead with slow, deliberate steps, the kind that belonged to a man who has hauled more weight inside himself than anyone else ever saw. There was something steady in his walk that soothed her unsettled thoughts. There was something in his silence that stirred curiosity. Inside, everything felt larger than she expected. Oversized chairs, a broad table, high walls. Tucked into a quiet corner, however, was a small bedroom newly made. The bed looked unused, curtains bright as fresh linen, the little desk at a reachable height. You made this? She asked. He gave a short nod. Didn't know your size, so I guessed small. For the first time since leaving Boston, she let herself smile. Outside, the glare pressed at the windows, but inside that tiny room, a different kind of warmth wrapped around her. Nothing to do with the sun. That afternoon, Clara tried to cook. She burned the biscuits, left the beans half done, and filled the kitchen with cough-inducing smoke. Graham came in, coughed once, and wordlessly opened a window to draw the fumes away. You can laugh, she said, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. He let out a laugh at last, low and warm. Guess we'll live on coffee till you learn the rest, he said. Her laugh joined his, tentative but true. It wasn't perfect, yet it felt like the first stitch of a home being sewn. She turned to thank him, but he had already stepped back outside, boots crunching on the gravel. From the window, she watched his broad shape move across the yard, a quiet figure in the light, and wondered for the first time, what kind of man builds a place so carefully and lives inside it all alone? Days folded over one another under the heavy summer sun. The cut on Clara's knee began to knit closed, though it still throbbed when she walked. Life on the ranch moved at a slow rhythm, the hours blurring like heat over the plains. Graham worked from dawn until dusk, a man of few words, and the silence sometimes pressed down on her. One bright noon she decided she would ride into town for sugar, maybe a scrap of cloth, she told herself. Anything to feel like herself again. The general store was half empty. A cluster of men lingered at the counter, hats tipped low, voices loud in the small room. Roy Tanner looked up as she came in, his grin crooked, his eyes soft with whiskey. Well now, he drawled. That must be Mrs. Holt. Heard Holt up and sent east for a wife. Clara forced a polite smile. Just here for sugar, she said. He stepped nearer, too close. Sure he's treating you right? A man like him's got a temper. She tried to pass by, but his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. The grip froze her. Every old scar and old fear woke at once. Let me go, she whispered, voice trembling. He chuckled. Relax, sweetheart. I'm just talking. The door slammed open. Graham filled the frame, a dark shape cutting the sun. His eyes fixed on Roy's hand wrapped at her arm. The room dropped into silence. Let her go, Roy, he said. Roy smirked and stayed where he was. Didn't mean no harm. Roy grinned, refusing. Graham moved forward, calm and cold. You ever touch her again? He said, voice flat as a knife. I'll bury you right where you stand. No one in the store doubted he meant every word. For the first crack in Roy's smug grin, uncertainty slid in. Roy stumbled backward, mumbling curses under his breath, but Graham didn't spare him another look. Instead, he reached for Clara's hand and, steady now, almost tender, and guided her outside. The noon sun hit hard, slicing through the street with blinding light. Neither spoke until they reached the wagon. You all right? He asked quietly. Clara nodded, though her pulse was still thudding in her ears. I am now. He let out a long breath, fingers tightening around the reins. Men like him talk more than they act. Don't let their words get in your head. The road back to the ranch stayed quiet, but the silence felt different. Not cold, just full of something unspoken. He had stepped in for her without a thought, and for the first time since arriving, Clara felt safe enough to breathe. As the wagon crested the ridge, the ranch spread before them again, still sunlit alive under the wide blue sky. She glanced sideways at him, studying the lines of his face hardened by years of solitude. What kind of man fights like that but chooses to live apart from everyone? And why did the idea of leaving him suddenly feel like a kind of loss she couldn't bear? If you're still here, maybe pour yourself a cup of tea. Tell me what time it is where you're listening from. And if you want to find out what happens next between Clara and Graham, you might want to subscribe before the story rides on. The days following that confrontation passed more gently, at least on the surface. Roy Tanner kept his distance. But in Dust Valley, quiet was only the space where rumors took their first breath. Whispers always found a way to travel faster than wind. At first, Clara ignored them. There was work to be done. Bread to bake, floors to sweep, her leg to rest and heal. One afternoon, while drawing water from the well, 2 women from town approached on horseback. Their bonnets were tied tight, their faces gleaming with sweat and gossip. "Mrs. Holt," one called with a smile too sweet to be kind. "We heard about what happened with Roy. Must have been a fright." The other leaned closer, voice dropping. "Though some folks say your husband's temper makes Roy look tame. People talk, you know." Clara froze, the rope slipping from her hand. The bucket fell, splashing water across her skirt. "I don't listen to gossip," she said softly. "Maybe you should," the first woman replied, tugging her reins. "Some say Graham killed a man once and down in Texas shot him in the back. You really trust a man like that?" They rode off laughing, dust curling behind their horses, leaving the words to settle in the air like grit. Killed a man. Clara wanted to shake it off, to tell herself it wasn't true, but the rumor clung to her mind like burrs to a hem. That evening, Graham came home later than usual. Dust streaked his boots, his face unreadable beneath the fading light. Clara watched as he sat at the table, poured water over his hands, and rubbed at his temples. "Something wrong in town?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Same talk as always." "Let it blow over," she hesitated. "Is it true? Did you really—" He drew a long breath and looked out the window before speaking. "I've fought for what's mine. Sometimes that means blood. But I'm not the man they're painting." He raised his head suddenly, eyes sharp as steel. "No, Clara, I've done things I ain't proud of. Out here, a man fights if he wants to keep breathing." He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping hard against the floor. "I won't explain myself to folks who don't matter." Then he turned and stepped out onto the porch, the screen door creaking shut behind him. Clara stayed at the table, staring at the half-empty cup in front of her. She didn't want to doubt him, not after everything. But doubt had a strange way of whispering louder than the truth. The next morning, when they rode into town for supplies, every gaze followed them. Conversations faltered mid-word. Men stopped what they were doing. Women turned to whisper behind gloved hands. Somewhere in the hush, a single voice muttered, "Murderer." Graham didn't slow down. His shoulders squared, his eyes fixed straight ahead, jaw set like stone. But Clara felt every stare like a needle. Her chest burned hot with anger and something else, pride. She stopped right there on the wooden boardwalk, turned to face the murmuring crowd, and raised her chin. "You're wrong about him," she said, her voice trembling at first, then steadying like a flame that refused to die. "He's the kindest man I've ever known. And if you think he's dangerous, maybe you should ask who made him that way." The words hung in the air, sharp as a whip crack. No one replied. Only the wind stirred, carrying her voice through the stillness. Graham turned then, surprise flickering in his eyes. For the first time in days, he smiled. It was small, worn around the edges, but real. They rode home through the soft gold of evening, the sun sinking low over Dust Valley. The wind had quieted, brushing through the tall grass like a fading song. Graham led the way, silent as ever, his face etched with lines that told of years and losses. Clara followed close behind, her mind heavy with questions but her heart strangely steady. If the town was against them now, what would happen when trouble came knocking again? At the ranch, the light had turned amber and still. Graham dismounted first and helped her down from her horse, his hand firm, his touch careful. Neither of them spoke, but the space between them was thick with things they didn't need to say. Inside, he set his hat on the table, poured 2 tin cups of water, and finally broke the quiet. "You shouldn't have done that in town," he said, voice low. "They'll only talk more now." Clara gave a faint smile, her eyes catching the last of the light. "Let them talk," she said softly. "You stood up for me once. It was my turn." He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his steady gaze. Like a man realizing a burden he'd carried alone didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. "You're tougher than you look, Mrs. Holt. And you're gentler than you think, Mr. Holt." They both laughed then, quiet, tired, but honest. The rest of the world seemed far away, irrelevant beyond those walls, just 2 worn souls scarred and stubborn, learning what it meant to stay instead of run. Later, when the heat gave way to the cool hush of evening, they sat outside at the same old table where he'd once cleaned her wound. Above them, the sky stretched wide and endless, painted in slow-fading gold. The silence felt different now, not empty but full, settled. Clara spoke first. "You know, I used to think running was the only way to survive. But maybe what saves us isn't escaping. Maybe it's staying long enough to build something." Graham nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Out here, everything takes time. Fences, trust. Love too, I reckon." She smiled, resting her hands on the worn wood. "You built this place for yourself once. Then you built a part of it for me. I think that's what love looks like, making space for someone else to fit." He turned toward her, his voice low and gentle. "Guess we made it fit after all." The light faded slow, the crickets started their song, and the valley settled under the weight of peace. In that quiet corner of the wild, 2 hearts that had wandered too long finally found their way home. Sometimes life leaves you with scars, reminders of where you've been. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it gives you someone to remind you where you belong. So tell me, have you ever met someone who made you feel safe enough to stop running? Or are you still waiting for that kind of love? If this story found a place in your heart, maybe give it a like. It helps other souls find their way here. And if you'd like to keep riding with me through the dust and the stories of the Old West, go on and subscribe. Pour another cup of tea, lean back, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Because stories like this aren't just about the past. They're about all of us, still trying in our own ways to make it fit.